Okay, great. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are joining us in the world. My name is Laura LeBur, and I'm a marine science educator here at the Smithsonian Marine Ecosystems exhibit. Welcome back to our Career Dive series. We're now in July. I don't know if you guys can believe it, but here we are. This summer series will highlight the career tracks, interests, and projects of marine science professionals working with the Smithsonian Marine Station and the Marine Ecosystems exhibit. So like I said before, while you're joining us, please continue to use the chat button at the bottom of your screen and let us know where you are right now. Hey, Sophie from Massachusetts. Hey, Emma from Oregon. Oh my gosh, yes, it is super early there right now. Thanks for joining us. Hey, Angela from Maryland. Hey, Corey from Vero Beach. Hi, Ronan from New York. Welcome back. Jessica from Virginia. Welcome, everyone. Someone's from the west coast of Africa. Wow, thank you so much for joining us. So, as everyone joins the webinar, I'd like to just point out some features. At the bottom of the screen, you can use the Q&A box to ask your questions to our guests. Please only ask questions in the Q&A. It's at the bottom of your screen and it has the 2 speech bubbles. You can submit your questions at any time, but we might not get to them right away. So we'll try to get to them we'll try to get to as many questions as possible, and we may answer some at the end. Please be patient with us as there may be a high influx of questions and we might not be able to get to all of them. There's another educator in the background named Erin, and she'll be keeping track of your questions. So if you see a message on the chat box, it'll be coming from her. Throughout the program, you can use the chat box to send us messages and answer any questions that we may have for you. Your comments are only visible to Smithsonian staff, so please keep them on topic and appropriate. So that's all the housekeeping items. Today's program is going to be about 40 minutes, and let's go ahead and get started. So it's my pleasure today to introduce to you Dean Janiak, a marine biologist that studies community ecology, which, if you don't know, is the way animals interact with each other and the surrounding environment. He's been with the Smithsonian for over 10 years and is interested in really anything that goes on in the ocean. Dean's most interested, though, in why a community of animals looks the way that it does, especially around artificial structures. And he's going to tell you a little bit more about that and why it's so important. So artificial structures are something like docks, marinas, seawalls. They're human-made structures. And how do these human-impacted areas affect the nearby natural habitat and the animals that live there? So lastly, to introduce him, he's got amazing accomplishments, but he's the lead for all operations related to Smithsonian's MarineGEO project at the Smithsonian Marine Station. So good morning, Dean.
Good morning. Thank you, everybody, for showing up this morning. Happy to be here.
Well, let's get started and dive right into your career dive. So we're gonna, I guess, jump all the way back to the beginning of your career. How did you get interested in marine science?
So when I was a kid, I wasn't one of those kids that loved nature or loved science or going to the ocean. I did spend a lot of time outside, though, but this was mostly playing sports. And so, you know, I played throughout most of my childhood and into high school, hockey in the winter, baseball in the spring, soccer in the summer, football in the fall. And so throughout my childhood, and even throughout high school, I wasn't really thinking much about my career. I never had any career plans. I just sort of, you know, lived day to day. And it really wasn't it wasn't until somewhat into college where I started to get into science. And I think a lot of that had to do with some of the friends that I had at the time. They were biology majors, and I started to, you know, learn a little bit about what they were studying and what they were into. And then that sort of got me on the track to you know, do a little bit of biology. And once I started to do it, I really started to fall in love with it, and it was pretty interesting. And so, yeah, I mean, I was, you know, normal kid, not a science kid at all. And so, and I found, you know, later in life in college that was sort of my passion, was to do a lot of that work.
And something I thought was really unique that you shared with me yesterday was that you weren't really so science-minded, but you really were curious, and you had an interesting way of asking questions and sort of putting facts in order. And I think, you know, maybe your science background, how you got into it isn't apparent, but it's always that like questioning why things are and how they happen.
Yeah, so I don't, you know, I never wasn't ever passionate about the ocean. I didn't, you know, I didn't want to learn as much as I could about it. Once I started to do science, and I realized that science is it's a question-driven career path, and so you just take observations of what you're seeing, and then you can ask questions about that, and then you do experiments, and then you figure out the answer or the mechanism to why things are the way they are. For instance, when you look at a coral reef, why does a coral reef look like that? And there's a lot of reasons why it looks like that. It's just not animals coming in and living there. There's a lot of things happening, and you can separate those things out and you can test them, and then you start to figure out why that looks the way it does, and you can apply that to any habitat in the ocean or even in the land. And so I like the question aspect of science, and I like to answer some of my questions that I have with simple experiments.
So you decided to go to an undergraduate degree in biology at Humboldt State University.
Mm-hmm.
Would you tell us a little bit more about that experience and maybe how you decided that you were gonna be a scientist?
Yes, so when I was at Humboldt, I started I did the biology major, and it was in my second semester, I think, and I was in a zoology class. And I remember that my zoology teacher asked if anybody wanted to help his graduate student out doing some intertidal work. And I think we had to wake up like at 3:30 or 4 a.m. on a Saturday morning. And when you're a freshman, sophomore in college, waking up that early on a Saturday morning is not something a lot of people like to do. But I did, and I was the only one out of a large class that went out and helped. And going out that morning sort of, it changed my career. Seeing all these different types of animals that I've never heard of or even seen before, and learning about them and learning how they make a living, and learning that they're just right there off, right in my backyard was fascinating to me. And then I started to, I was inquiring about like what the graduate student was doing, the questions that he was asking, and all of a sudden, like I was just got on the bus. I was drawn in, and it hasn't stopped from there. So yeah, that was going out and helping graduate students was the way that I got started, just to see how actual science is done. So that was pretty cool.
Continued into your graduate because you received a master's degree in marine oceanography from University of Connecticut. So how did your focus switch from undergrad to graduate, and what did you focus on for your research at UC?
So when I was, I want to share my screen here. So here's me graduating at Humboldt, and so Humboldt was an incredible place. We had, we had redwoods in my backyard. We had this beautiful Pacific coastline. Here's some of California coastline. It's let me see. So I did a lot of intertidal ecology work. So this is when the water goes out, and you get these beautiful communities of algae and invertebrates that are exposed as the water goes out. And this sort of really got me interested in science, and not diving or anything, but just sort of working in these different types of communities. And while I was at Humboldt, I started to get into what we call fouling communities. And that's, this picture was something that I was working on around 2002. So, almost 20 years ago. And I'm doing the same thing today, which is pretty remarkable. But one of the things that I study is these little fouling communities. And these are just communities of animals that most people probably haven't ever heard of, but they're doing interesting things, and they're growing on these little pieces of plastic. And so that's a fouling panel, and it's what, you know, I carry around with me wherever I go, and I put them in the water and see what's growing on them. So doing this as an undergraduate, it really got me interested in working with these communities. And so when I wanted to go to graduate school, I wanted to work with somebody who was doing this type of work, working with fouling communities and doing some interesting theoretical ecology. And I found somebody, his name was Bob Whitlatch, who's a famous marine ecologist at the University of Connecticut. And so I went there to do a master's, and I ended up working, I did a little bit of work with fouling species, but I ended up working in the intertidal, working on macroalgae. And so I worked on an invasive macroalgae called Guadalupe, and I can show you a picture of what that looks like. So this is Guadalupe here, and it's an invasive alga in Long Island Sound. And I worked with that, and I worked with how it provides habitat for smaller animals, amphipods, which is one of my big passions. These things they're incredibly small, they're incredibly difficult to identify, but they do a lot of cool things. And so when I was in school, I worked a lot with those. And so completely different from what I was doing before, but I realized quickly that I could ask the same types of questions depending in different habitats. And that was pretty kind of, you know, not earth shattering to me, but it made me realize that science is, you know, we really like to come up with general ideas about different things. And you can ask simple questions in different types of habitats and you can find sort of similar answers. And to me, that means that, you know, the ocean as a whole is working in a similar way. And so it's a fascinating thing when you can kind of ask one question in, you know, a coral reef and the same exact question in an oyster reef or a seagrass bed. And it, you know, it helps build, you know, the fundamental sort of themes in ecology. So that was, for me, you know, and I think for most scientists, you know, that we jump around in different habitats, we do different things, but we always kind of do the same thing, which is pretty neat.
So Dean, I think we didn't get the second half pictures from the slideshow, but I also wanted to just jump in and say we had one really good question from Ronan. So we wanted to make sure we were hearing you correctly. And I think the word is fouling, F-O-U-L-I-N-G. So yes, these communities grow on substrate in the ocean, right?
Yeah, so let's see.
Thanks, Ronan, for asking your question. Feel free to keep asking questions in the Q&A. If we don't answer your question right away, it's because we're going to be saving it for the end.
So here's fouling. These are fouling communities, and on the lower screen, these are just two of these sort of small pieces of plastic, and they have tons of different species on them. And we put them in different types of habitat, and they collect different things on them, and we can ask a variety of different questions on why those communities look the way they do, what's going on in there, who's eating them, are they competing with each other? And so fouling communities have been, ever since, you know, marine science has sort of started, people have been putting these types of things in the water to look at the animals growing on them. And so it's a very old theme in ecology. And we've done a lot of really interesting theoretical work using these communities, manipulating them in different ways to look at sort of general processes that are occurring. Plus, they have a lot of cool things on there that most people haven't, you know, ever even heard of, and so it's really interesting to learn about common things in the ocean that you don't typically see. So yeah, I do a lot of work with fouling communities.
They're super cool. And I think as we build more and more structure in the ocean, it's really important to understand how those communities are growing together and what the predator, maybe prey interactions look like and how they're influencing the surrounding environment. So I guess without further ado, maybe we'll transition to how you came to the Smithsonian. You've been here for 10 years, and I know that you haven't been at the Marine Station for all 10. So do you want to share a little bit more about that journey? Because it kind of overlaps with your graduate degree, right?
Yeah, so when I was in graduate school at the University of Connecticut, my advisor, Bob Whitlatch, he worked closely with Rick Osman, who was a principal investigator of the benthic ecology lab at the Smithsonian in Maryland. So during the summers, Rick would come up and work with Bob, and I got to know Rick and did some work together. And he told me about a position he had open that was coming online. And within a month or two, I moved down to Maryland to start working there. And thankfully, he let me finish working on my thesis while I was down there. And then a month or two later, I went back up to the University of Connecticut and presented my thesis and officially graduated. But I was the head technician in the benthic ecology lab at the Smithsonian in the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center in Edgewater, Maryland, on the north end of the Chesapeake Bay. I was there for 5 years. It was difficult for me to work there because it's on the tippity top of Chesapeake Bay, so the water isn't salty, it's muddy, it's murky, there's not a lot of marine life there. And so it was difficult to come up with interesting questions. We did some cool stuff. But during that time, we had gotten a lot of grants to come down to Florida to do research at the Smithsonian Marine Station. And coming down here and having the Indian River Lagoon in the Atlantic, right in your backyard, I got to work with a lot of animals that I'm much more interested in. And so Rick was retiring soon, and this MarineGEO program that I haven't really talked about yet was coming up. And so I basically jumped at the chance, and then, I don't know, a couple months later, moved down to Florida, continuing my career at the Smithsonian. And so I've been in Florida now for about 5 years, working on this MarineGEO program. And so certainly happy that I'm here. Yeah, there's Florida, the marine life in Florida is incredible, and there's certainly a lot to do. There's a lot we don't know, so it gives me a lot of good opportunity to do a lot of interesting work.
I think it's so cool how you mentioned about working with algae and working with the biofouling communities, because I think a lot of people, when they envision marine biology, we get a lot of, oh, I wanted to work with cetaceans and with dolphins and with very charismatic megafauna like sea turtles. And I think this is those are very unique opportunities, and they're very highly competitive, but a lot of us end up working and understanding very small things that require a lot of other skills. And I want to ask you a question, because I know we talked about it a couple times, and we've had this question a few times in our webinars, and that's, do you need to be a scuba diver to be a marine biologist?
So I'm not a scuba diver. When I was when I was an undergraduate in 2003, I had gotten sick. We think it was SARS, but there wasn't a test for SARS at the time. I was in the hospital for a week, ventilator, et cetera, and it damaged my lungs. And so I didn't know this at the time, but when I got hired at the Smithsonian, I went to get my scuba certification, and the doctors were like, "No way! Like you're not going down at depth with your lungs." And so medically, I can't dive, but I mean that was certainly heartbreaking, because as a marine biologist, you want to be in the water. I can still snorkel, but I've found other ways to answer my questions. And as a marine biologist, there are a lot of things you can do that you don't need to be a diver for. A diver is just a tool to do certain things. But for instance, in California, there's the intertidal, which is it's an amazing place. You go out in waders or in dive booties, and you can work there. On the East Coast, there's tons of different places that that you can work at: oyster reefs, mud flats. There's a lot of interesting ecology going on there. Mangroves, all sorts of different things. And so scuba is just a small part of it, and it's more of a recreational thing for a lot of people. They just like to scuba, and then they get some of their work done. But you certainly don't need to be a diver to do marine biology at all. In fact, you know, with these fouling communities that I work on, I can put them in anywhere in the ocean, and I'm still looking at the same types of animals. And so I don't have to physically be in the water to ask a lot of these questions, although I'd like to be. I don't. And so, no, I mean, you certainly don't need to have your scuba. You don't need to scuba to be a marine biologist. And a lot of people don't. And even if you're looking at, you know, molecular stuff in the ocean, you don't need scuba to do that. You need to have good, you know, lab skills instead. And so there's a lot of different things. Even, you know, there's a big surge in doing sophisticated statistics and modeling with a lot of oceanographic data. And so that is still, you know, you're still doing marine stuff, but you know, you're not in the water. And so I would certainly say there's a lot of opportunity without having scuba.
I love that. There's no one way to be a marine biologist.
Sure. Very true.
Many different ways. So we're going to take just pause for a second, because we've had some really good questions come in, and I'll ask them to you. And if you think that it might take a little while to explain, we can save them for the end. But Ronan would like to know, especially talking about artificial structures, how do you think the huge wind turbine projects in New York Bight will shift the ecology and marine environment of different creatures and animals?
So
complicated question.
So what's going on in New York?
They're doing big wind turbines.
Well, there's a couple aspects of that. First of all, a wind turbine makes noise, and we're slowly learning that noise in the ocean is a problem for a lot of the bigger animals, cetaceans, turtles, things like that. My experience is in artificial structures, and well, my expertise is in artificial structures. So I do a lot of work on looking at the animals that are living on docks or seawalls, anything that, you know, a human has put into the ocean and that shouldn't be there. And there's a lot of animals that grow on these things, and we don't know much about them, and not a lot of people study them. And so it's I'm filling that sort of gap in knowledge. One of the things we do know is that on these artificial structures, there's a lot of non-native species. And so when you get a new invasive or non-native species coming into your area, it's probably going to be found on a dock. And there's a variety of reasons for that. And so one of the things we're interested in is does that non-native spread into natural habitat, like on a seagrass blade or an oyster reef or something like that. And so with these big wind turbines, you're providing all of this new concrete substrate in the ocean. And for me, you're going to find a lot of non-native species on there. It also provides a little bit of fish habitat, but there's not a lot of data that suggests that, you know, that fishing or that the fishes in the ocean are that greatly reduced that we need to create artificial structures for that. Now that there's benefits to the wind turbines as well, so it's clean energy, right? And so you have to weigh the pluses and the minuses. But from my expertise, I would be very curious to look at the animals growing on that, because it's going to be filled within a couple of months. It'll be filled with a ton of different animals, and you know who those animals are, where they're coming from, how are they making a living, who's eating them, and those types of things. So that would be and I'm sure I would assume they're going to hire out for somebody to look at that. That's part of the requirements when you're putting in a large infrastructure like that. You need to follow, you know, you have to have some sort of scientific report following that through time. But yeah, so my initial concerns or interest would be to look at all the animals growing on those types of things.
And they're definitely growing there, because as soon as you put in space for these animals to grow, they will take it over.
Yeah, so that's one of the coolest things about the ocean. I don't know if it's cool or not, but it's fascinating. You can put in anything in the ocean. You put in something hard in the ocean, and you're going to find an animal growing on it. And you know, there's a lot of trash in the ocean. There's a lot of garbage, and that's one of the new things that we're sort of studying is how this trash is floating around the ocean and all the animals living on it. But I mean, that's one of the reasons why I like fouling communities, is that I can put a piece of plastic in the ocean and I can get a completely natural community growing on that, and I can manipulate it in different ways. And so It's very different from a terrestrial system where you can't just put something out and things are going to start growing in it. I guess you could put out like a bucket of soil and plants would start to grow in it. But the ocean's fascinating in the sense that there's just little larvae swimming around everywhere, and they like to grow on things, and it's makes experiments very simple and easy to do.
So that kind of segues into Suzanne's question. Suzanne asks about a water intake in Puget Sound, and there used to be a community of invertebrates growing on them, and they were growing to the point where they started blocking the water intake. And I know especially in areas like in the Great Lakes, there's a couple different species of invertebrates that can be quite damaging, and the removal of them and keeping them under control costs a lot of money. But Suzanne wants to know, do you know if there's any way to discourage new larvae from settling in the same spot, and if like it would be, how it is possible?
So I haven't personally, but I've done a little bit of this, but there's a big industry for anti-fouling paint. And I think right now the consensus is that copper paint is the best thing, but it doesn't work very well all the time. And so everywhere where you're going to put something hard into the water, in the marine water, it's going to get fouled, and things are going to keep growing until it gets clogged up. And so there is a lot of funding out there that different people have to look at how they can come up with some sort of figure out the chemistry to prevent larvae from settling on these things. But it hasn't been solved yet. It's very difficult to do. One of the things, sort of a more holistic thing that we've done in the past under boats is just put a bubbler, like a bubbler you'd have in your aquarium, and having those bubbles come up underneath the boat prevents larvae from attaching. And that's helped a lot, and that's not putting chemicals in the water, and that's lowering the fouling. But it's a constant problem. You could ask any person who owns a boat and what their what the biggest issue of owning a boat is, and it's probably cleaning the fouling off the bottom of your boat. So that's discouraging for, from a citizen point of view, but it's fascinating to me because I like to study those types of things. And so there's a lot of cool animals. Like when we go out and we do bio blitzes, and so when we're looking to collect a lot of animals to identify them, the first thing we'll do is we'll go find a boat and pull it up and look underneath and find all the cool critters that are living there. But we haven't come up with a way to stop fouling, and I don't know if there is a way. Just animals like to settle on hard things, and they like to grow. And once you get an initial covering of that copper layer or whatever that anti-fouling paint is, things are going to grow on top of that, and then it's just going to compound, and it's going to clog. And so we have a lot of sophisticated temperature loggers in the water that get fouled pretty quickly, and the only way that we found to deal with that is just to clean them weekly. So that's usually the best solution, is you just have to go out there and just clean.
It's a really, I think, expensive way to prevent that, because those little animals that are settling, they won't be stopped. But we're going to keep it moving. We have this question. Sharon's question actually ties into the next section of your journey. She asks, do fouling communities contribute to the ocean ecosystem? And I think that's a great question to lead into a little bit more about the MarineGEO Project. What is the MarineGEO Project, and what do you study?
So the MarineGEO Project, it's relatively new. It's incredibly dynamic and fascinating. And so our goal is to basically study marine biodiversity and how it's changing in coastal ecosystems. And so one of sort of a word that's been thrown around a lot in the past couple of years is biodiversity. And so for those of you who don't know what biodiversity is, it's just the number of different species in the ocean. The way that I like to view it is that if you imagine your house or a house, and every nail or screw in that house, no matter what size it is a different animal. If you start to pull those nails out wherever they're from, you're sort of affecting the integrity of that house, and it's going to collapse. And that's a sort of a really good analogy for how the ocean works. Regardless of how big or how small the animal is, if it becomes extinct for several different reasons, affecting the integrity of that ecosystem. And so obviously certain animals are a little bit more important to their environment than others. But one of the things that MarineGEO does is that we want to know who's in the water, what they're doing, and then the causes and the consequences of you know, if that species were to be removed or whatever. So it's basically a biodiversity program, and it's completely novel because most programs look at changes in ocean temperature or salinity, and we're pretty much the only one that looks at the actual animals in the ocean. And that's because it's difficult to do. But the program is a global program of network partners. And so we have partners all over the world that are doing standardized monitoring of different habitats in a similar way. So one of the problems with science is that as a scientist, so I'm looking at my backyard right now. I know my backyard really well. I know, you know, the plants and the animals in there, and I know how it works, but I don't know how my backyard compares to somebody else's backyard because we're studying it differently. That's a problem because we can't ask global questions on how, you know, coral reefs are doing as a whole or seagrasses are doing as a whole. And so what MarineGEO is doing is that we're coming up with these standardized ways to sample these different types of habitats, and we do them annually. And so now we can ask bigger questions on, you know, coral reefs as a whole, or you know, some of these other important habitats and how they're functioning across the globe and just not locally. And so that's fascinating because that really hasn't been done before in science. We're really good at, you know, doing the local stuff, but when it comes to the global stuff, it's a little bit more different. So that's in a nutshell, that's kind of what MarineGEO is. And we couple our monitoring with a lot of experiments. And so we do these pretty interesting global experiments where we're doing the same experiment everywhere. And we're asking these really, you know, kind of cool questions. And so we're looking at change, but we're also looking at the mechanisms of change. And so it's sort of a, you know, we're doing both ends of the science there. So very, very cool.
That is a really cool project. And I think it's really, my favorite part about the MarineGEO is that it's just this massive network of people who are all trying to understand the community. And as you said, you know, we could be neighbors and both looking at our backyards and come up with very different things. So the more people looking at the community ecology of these communities on artificial habitats, it's the better.
Yep.
So we'll take a question really quickly from Teddy. Teddy asks, what are good classes to pursue in college for those interested in marine biology? And I think there's a lot of answers to this question, but maybe you could mention the ones that you found were the most successful for you.
So it depends on what school you're at and what they offer. A lot of schools don't offer a lot of marine biology classes. I was fortunate when I went to Humboldt State, I had zoology, invertebrate zoology, intertidal ecology. So I had a lot of ecology classes that were kind of marine geared. And so I would say, you know, general biology and things like that are important, but they're not specific enough where people can get excited about that kind of career path. I would say that for me, one of the cool things is that there's a lot of summer programs, and there's a lot of programs at different universities that have very specific marine focused classes. So there's schools at Shoals from the University of New Hampshire. There's University of Washington has incredible classes where you take a semester of one of their classes there and you're pretty much an expert in marine ecology. It's fascinating. And so I would encourage people to explore places outside of their campus and explore, you know, different parts of the country where there's these programs going on. I think there's some in Florida too, where you can come for a semester or a summer and learn about different themes in marine biology. And so that was always a lot of colleagues of mine had done that when they weren't getting the classes that they needed at their university. And I mean, you meet a lot of people that you're probably going to know the rest of your life that are going to become colleagues later. Besides biology, statistics is incredibly important because that's how we analyze our data. So we go and we collect data and we have to present it somehow. And so we use a lot of sophisticated statistics. And so it's not math per se, but you need to know how to do a lot of different calculations with the data you're collecting. So statistics is really, really important. And then besides that, molecular biology is pretty important these days. And so I stress to all my interns that they should know how to do a lot of the molecular work that's happening, because you can ask a lot of interesting questions just using molecular data. And so taking tissue samples of animals and looking at a variety of different things. And most schools have a good molecular department, and it doesn't necessarily have to be biology based, but knowing those techniques is pretty important. I didn't have those when I was an undergraduate, and so I don't have that skill set, but I'm learning it over time and just working with different people. So I would say the molecular stuff and statistics, besides the biology classes, are probably the most important.
Yeah, that was a great question. And I think for me too, I definitely reflect that as well. I never took, I took one statistics class my freshman year of college, and increasingly when we have conversations, like I had to do stats for my master's and I had to teach myself how to use the software because I don't know. Mm-hmm. So if you are in college now and you see a class on R, which is a very common statistical software, or any kind of stats modeling software, take it, because you will most likely need it.
You will need it. Yeah,
you will need it, or you'll have to find someone and then pay them to do it for you. So either way. We'll take a couple more questions. So before we do though, Dean, we are getting up on the 40-minute mark. So I just want to check in and see, do you have a couple minutes to stay after and answer some questions?
All day, yep.
All right, cool. Well, we will, I will say if you need to go and you're only here for the 40 minutes, thank you so much for joining us. We are going to take some questions, but please make sure to check in the chat and join us for our next Career Dives live conversation in marine science. We're going to be interviewing Kelly Pitts, a technician for Coral Health and Marine Probiotics Lab at the Smithsonian Marine Station. She's incredible, and if you want to hear all about scuba diving, that's going to be the webinar for you. But in the meantime, Dean, we've got a couple more questions.
Sure.
So maybe you aren't the best person for this question or these two questions, but Brock has been very patient and would really like to know, how was there sand when the dinosaurs were around and there was no coral and no parrotfish?
That's probably, I'm not a paleontologist, and that's probably not something I can answer. I'm not sure that, I guess my first question was, how do we know that sand was around? Because if,
maybe there wasn't sand then.
Maybe there wasn't sand, but I think that sand is also broken up rock too. I mean, it's not all sand that you see on the beach is not coral. And so most sand is glass. It's just small pieces of glass that are broken up. So I guess related to that, so rain is naturally acidic. It's slightly acidic. It's acidic enough that over time it's rained, and then when that rain hits mountains, the mountains leach out salt in smaller rocks, and that all flows into the ocean. And that's why the ocean is salty, is because of rainwater. So all those rocks being broken down over time, the smaller you are, you're just going to get broken down more rapidly. And I would presume that most of the sand on beaches is coming from rocks. I mean, the earth is made up of rock. And so I don't think most of that sand is not coming from corals anyway.
Yeah, and I would just add to that too. There's, those are two ways we get a lot of sand on our beaches, but they're not the only two. So as you said, erosion takes a big part. Some of the sand here locally in Florida is actually from an algae that takes in calcium carbonate. So there's more than one way, I guess, to get sand, but that was an interesting question, Brock, and thank you for being patient and waiting for us to get to it. Teddy wants to know another career-driven question. So with marine biology as your specialty, what are the different types of jobs you have? I mean, I think if you stay tuned for the rest of our webinar series, Teddy, you might be able to hear quite a few, but I mean, not all of us have marine biology degrees. I know for me, I just have a biology undergraduate, and then I specialize in marine issues for my master's, but maybe Dean, you could talk a little bit more about what that looks like.
So for me, I only have a master's in oceanography. I didn't want a PhD. I didn't want to go into that field because once you have a PhD, you're not really doing the science anymore. You're writing a lot of, you're writing for grants and you're teaching. I really like doing field work and writing up papers and analyzing data and then having interns. And so depends on, I mean, if you were thinking in terms of a career, having an undergraduate degree in biology, there's not a lot you can do. Well, probably because it's question-driven career path, and so you should be thinking about graduate school where you're asking your own types of questions and you're doing your own types of science. A lot of people in the sciences go on to teaching, and so that's probably the biggest thing. There are few places like the Smithsonian where I'm a research scientist, so I spend all day doing research and writing up papers and presenting them. And I love doing that. Laura's an educator, and so she spends a lot of her time educating, doing citizen science and educating the public on different aspects of science, whether it's marine or terrestrial or whatnot. There's a lot of private companies that hire, and a lot of them do permitting work. And so when you need to, for instance, put in a big turbine in New York, they need to get permits. And so they have internal scientists who go out and collect a lot of data on how that's going to affect the habitats. And so there's a big private sector too. One of my passions is taxonomy. And so I do a lot of marine taxonomy. So I work on animals from every phylum, from sponges up to ascidians. And there's certainly a lot of jobs where people are doing just pure taxonomy for different companies who hire them to do different things. And so most of the jobs are going to be in academic places, but there's a lot of private sector jobs. There's a lot of state position jobs where the state, if you're on a coastal state, you have a DEP or you have some sort of state agency that does a lot of the science around the state. So we work closely with a lot of state agencies doing different types of monitoring in the water. So there's a lot of stuff out there, but it's very competitive. And so that's the challenging behind science. If I knew how competitive it was when I was younger, it might have dissuaded me a little bit from going on. But if you really like doing it, you know, you're going to get somewhere. And so it's a passionate career. But there's a lot out there.
So the last question we're going to take, I think, for today is one that you anticipated yesterday. But Katrina was gracious enough to narrow it down to 3 for you. So she says, pick a favorite: tunicates, sponges, or polychaetes. I'm glad you asked Katrina because he knew it was going to be coming.
I didn't expect her to ask it though. I thought Katrina would ask a different question, but if I had to pick a group, well, they all do. So polychaetes are marine worms, and they do fascinating things because there's so many of them, and they all eat differently, and so they've evolved very different ways to eat things. And so when you look at a polychaete under a scope, they all look different, and they're pretty fascinating how they make a living. Sponges are cool. I don't do a lot of work with sponges. I have a colleague who does, and so he's shown me how cool they can be. I do a lot of work with tunicates, so ascidians. They're fascinating, and a lot of ascidians are non-native, and so I do a lot of work with invasive species, and so I spend a lot of time reading the literature on tunicates and ascidians. And so I'm going to have to go with, I'm going to choose D, which is all of the above, because I don't have a favorite animal. I'm a community ecologist, and so my questions and interests lie in how different types of things like, for instance, there's a lot of polychaetes that live in sponges. And so therefore, like that's fascinating to me. And so, you know, I like that relationship. And so I couldn't pick just one, even if it's a large group, like those choices. I like how different animals interact with each other. And so that's going to be my answer.
No, I think that's really fair. I think it's something we have had quite a few questions to ask. What's our favorite? And I know for all of our experts that we've talked to, it's been really hard to choose just one. But I really like your answer about saying, you know, it's not just about the one particular animal. It's more about the whole community and what that looks like and how it functions together. And I think that is really, I mean, a really fascinating part of science. It's never just about the one organism. It's about how they all interact.
Very true.
So on that note, Dean, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your career path with us. We had a lot of really great questions. So thank you, audience and participants, for asking your questions in the Q&A. If we didn't have time for your question, I apologize. You're welcome to email us at smseducation@si.edu, and we'll do our best to get back to you with the appropriate answer. If you check in the chat, Erin will put that email address there for you. And she's also put the link for next week's webinar, which, like I said before, is going to be with Kelly Pitts. So please register, because that will be a really fun webinar. Kelly and I are friends, so I'm sure we'll be goofing off a little bit. But Dean, again, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed interviewing you and hearing a little bit more about the MarineGEO project here at the Smithsonian Marine Station. And I really like your approach to science and to marine biology. So I thought it was really cool that you shared that. Before we say a final goodbye, is there maybe like one word of wisdom you want to share with our participants today, or like one final thought?
Well, I would say if people listening are interested in having this as a career path, I think the most important thing that you can do is you can get involved. As a scientist, and I think any scientist in my lab or anywhere in the world, they always need help doing whatever it is they're doing. And so we're always looking for volunteers or interns or help. And that's one way to figure out you know, what actual scientists do. It's not something you're going to learn out of a textbook or see on TV. It's, you know, some of my best days have been knee deep in mud, you know, and so I think that if you get involved and you see what actual science is like, you're gonna find out if it's really for you or if it's really not. And so I would encourage people to do that, especially as an undergraduate. I take interns every summer, and I meet a lot of undergraduates who have no idea what real science is like. And some of them graduate and realize that it's not for them, and that's unfortunate. But at least they realize that, you know, nobody wants to be stuck in a position that they don't really like. And so if you get, you know, I've worked with high school students, I've worked with, you know, freshmen in college, and I give them the same, you know, experience as I would give a graduate student. Everybody's important, and everybody, you know, deserves a chance and to see what science is really like. And I mean, if you want to know, just go, and we love talking about our work. And so go talk to a scientist, go to the, you know, these different conferences and festivals and see what they actually do. And then you'll find out if this is the right sort of choice for you. So that would be my #1 recommendation.
Yeah, if you don't try something, you'll never know how much you like it, or maybe you don't like it, and that's totally fine too, but you know now that you've tried.
Yep.
Okay, my friends. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us, and thank you for all your amazing questions. Like I said before, if you want to get more engaged with the Smithsonian Marine Station and Ecosystems Exhibit, you can definitely check out our Facebook. It's Smithsonian Marine Station and Ecosystems Exhibit on Facebook. You can also get at us on Twitter and Instagram. We're Smithsonian SMS. So make sure to check in with us there. We post a lot of really good content. We also have a newsletter, so make sure you check the links on Facebook and subscribe, and we'll be getting more information from us. Thank you guys again so much for joining us. That's all the time we have for today, and we'll see you next week. Bye.